History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, where we explore history's most fascinating sieges. If you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them. In the middle of the 18th century, North America was not the sprawling independent continent we recognize today. It was a battleground for empires. Britain and France, two of the most powerful nations of the era, were locked in an unrelenting struggle for dominance, with their ambitions stretching across oceans. North America was one of the many fronts in this vast imperial contest, a raw and untamed land where their fortunes clashed through colonies, trade routes, and military fortifications. The events that unfolded here during the 1740s would not only shape the destiny of those two nations, but also lay the groundwork for revolutionary transformations to come. In 1744, war erupted between Britain and France in what was known as the War of the Austrian Succession. In Europe, this conflict revolved around dynastic claims and balance of power. But in North America, it took on a far more practical character. This was a battle for strategic control over key ports, valuable fishing waters, and access to critical waterways. It was here in the rugged northeastern corner of the continent that one of the most improbable and consequential campaigns of the century unfolded. Colonial militia, ordinary men without formal training, took on one of the most formidable fortresses in the New World, relying on little more than grit and ingenuity to achieve what the French and even the British thought impossible. The consequences of this campaign extended far beyond the immediate battlefield arena. For the colonists, it fostered an overconfidence in their military abilities, a perception that would color their relationship with Britain for decades. For the British Empire, it demonstrated both the vulnerabilities of imperial holdings and the unexpected potential of colonial forces. The decisions made in the aftermath of this siege would fan the flames of colonial resentment and sow the very seeds of rebellion, as the sacrifices of the American volunteers were undone by the cold calculus of European diplomacy. This episode will unravel how this critical chapter in North American history came to pass and how its outcome reverberated across the Atlantic and through the years. From the seeds of American independence to the shifting power structures of global empires, the events of this campaign shaped the world we live in today, revealing the precarious balance of power that defined the 18th century and beyond. Let's now experience the Siege of Louisbourg.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, Episode 7, The Siege of Louisbourg, the 1st of May to the 17th of June, 1745. American forces, 4,270 militiamen. French forces, roughly 560 Marines and Swiss mercenaries, and an additional 1,400 militia. The American victory instilled an unwarranted confidence in the colonies' military prowess, fostering a belief that their amateur forces could stand toe-to-toe with professional armies. Yet, this triumph was overshadowed by the betrayal felt when Louisbourg, hard won through their blood and sacrifice, was handed back to France in a distant peace negotiation. This decision by the British government deepened colonial resentment, planting the seeds of hostility that would only grow in the decades to come.
Throughout the 17th and well into the 18th century, Britain and France raced to carve their dominion into the wild expanse of North America. The British, striking first, laid claim to the lands along the continent's eastern seaboard, a tiny stretch of territory brimming with promise. The French, however, found themselves pushed into the colder, less forgiving expanse of modern-day Canada. Yet even this rugged northern frontier yielded its treasures. French trappers made fortunes from furs, while their fishermen combed the icy waters for catches that fed hungry European markets. But those waters soon became the flashpoint of tension. British colonists, their eyes on profit, disputed France's fishing rights, turning every haul of cod and every shipment of dried fish into another spark for colonial rivalry. The wars of Europe bled into the Americas, their rivalries taking root across the Atlantic. In the wake of the War of the Spanish Succession, Sealed by the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, France's son king, Louis XIV, resolved to strengthen his grip on the New World. He commanded the construction of a mighty fortress on Ile Royale, now Cape Breton Island, to guard the gateway to the St. Lawrence River and anchor French shipping in the region. Thus Louisbourg was born, envisioned as an unassailable bulwark. Work began in 1720, but the construction was slow and disorganized, dragging on for 2 decades. When completed, it earned the title the Gibraltar of North America, though the shine of that praise dulled quickly. Its cannons were few, its upkeep was neglected, and its people, French Marines and hired Swiss mercenaries, lacked the heart to match the fort's grandeur. In 1744, the embers of conflict flared once again as France declared war on Britain. In Europe, they called it the War of the Austrian Succession. In the New World, it became known as King George's War. Word of the war reached Boston, the beating heart of British America, in May of 1744. But Louisbourg, always ahead in such matters, had received the news 3 weeks earlier. The French wasted no time. Captain Francois du Vivier struck swiftly at Canso, a British outpost clinging to the eastern edge of Acadia, modern-day Nova Scotia. His forces overwhelmed the sparse British defenders, hauling them back to Louisbourg as prisoners. Months later, they would be released to Boston, their humiliation fresh in their minds. With momentum on his side, du Vivier turned his sights on Annapolis Royal, Britain's key port on Acadia's western coast. Yet this time, fortune slipped from his grasp. The attack failed. Meanwhile, French privateers based out of Louisbourg prowled the contested waters, preying on New England shipping all summer long, their presence a dagger at the throat of British trade. These bold French maneuvers sent shockwaves through British America, stirring alarm from the halls of Parliament to the farms of Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, Governor William Shirley saw the writing on the wall. Britain's armies were tied up in Europe, locked in bloody struggles far from the colonies. If New England was to deal with the French threat, it would have to do so with its own strength. Shirley put forth a bold proposal. An American force would storm Louisbourg itself. The plan wasn't born from blind ambition. New England's merchants knew the town well, having traded with its inhabitants for years. They understood its layout, its weaknesses, and most importantly, its defenders' poor morale. The prisoners recently returned from Canso confirmed what Shirley suspected. The walls of Louisbourg were crumbling, its garrison beaten down by neglect. Boston's people rallied to the idea, pressuring their legislature to approve the mission. The decision came down to a single vote. But in the end, the operation was greenlit. Command of the expedition fell to William Pepperell, a man of action and of ambition, a seasoned militia officer, a prosperous merchant, and head of the governor's council. Pepperell carried the weight of responsibility with a steady hand. Massachusetts answered the call with 3,300 volunteers, farmers, tradesmen, and frontiersmen eager for glory. Connecticut sent another 516, while New Hampshire added 454 of its own. Governor Shirley, knowing that ships would be the key to victory, reached across the Atlantic and secured British naval support. Commodore Peter Warren arrived with 3 warships from the Caribbean, ready to lend his cannons to the fight. By late March of 1745, this patchwork force set sail for Canso, their first target. The weather turned harsh, battering the fleet and leaving many of the farmer militiamen seasick and miserable. But when they reached Canso, the French defenders folded quickly, falling in early April without much of a fight. The Americans lingered at Canso for 3 weeks, turning the lull into an opportunity. Rudimentary drills honed the untrained volunteers into something resembling soldiers, while scouts watched for signs of the ice breaking in Louisbourg's Gabarus Harbor. When word finally came that the ice had cleared, and with word that Warren's warships now reinforcing their ranks, the men were emboldened. Their hearts burned with purpose as they set sail for Louisbourg, reaching its shores on April the 30th. The French garrison at Louisbourg was under the command of Governor Louis du Chambon, a man of limited resolve and little appetite for bold action. When the Americans staged a feint landing, Chambon took the bait, allowing the bulk of Pepperell's forces to come ashore virtually unchallenged 2 miles down the coast. Instead of meeting the invaders head-on, the French fell back into their fortress walls, waiting for the inevitable siege. Louisbourg's defenses were formidable in design, though flawed in execution. The heart of its strength lay in the main fort, just outside the town on the harbor's southwestern shore. Guarding the harbor's mouth stood the Island Battery, a smaller but strategically vital position. To the west, the Grand Battery completed the trio, its guns positioned to cover the others. Nearly every cannon in Louisbourg pointed toward the sea, prepared to repel a naval assault, but this left the fortress's landward side dangerously exposed, an oversight the Americans wasted no time exploiting. With no French resistance in sight, the Americans hauled men and artillery to the high ground that loomed over the French fortifications. Yet as they approached the main fort itself, the land turned treacherous, marshy, and difficult to navigate. The Americans struck their first blow before the siege had properly begun. On May 1st, Pepperell dispatched reconnaissance parties to probe the area, where they clashed with scattered French militia and their Micmac allies. Among these parties was one led by Colonel William Vaughan, a Boston merchant turned soldier who seized an opportunity to cripple the enemy. Vaughan's men torched French storehouses near the Grand Battery, and the sky darkened with a thick, choking smoke that blanketed the position in chaos. By dawn the next day, the Americans were stunned to find the Grand Battery abandoned. To this day, historians debate what caused the withdrawal, whether the defenders panicked and fled, or if du Chambon had ordered the retreat to consolidate his forces. Whatever the reason, the French left behind a bounty. 30 cannons sat intact, their firing mechanisms unspiked, alongside a vast stockpile of powder. Vaughan and his men wasted no time occupying the fortress. That afternoon, a French detachment rode back to the battery, only to be repulsed by Vaughan's troops. Whether these men came to retake the battery or retrieve supplies remains uncertain, but their attempt ended in failure. Before long, the Americans had the cannons back in operation, and their fire began hammering both Louisbourg itself and the Island Battery across the harbor. The Americans now turned to their heaviest weapons. Cannons brought from New England were hauled ashore on cumbersome, flat-bottomed barges, which struggled against the churning surf and jagged coastline. It was brutal work, but ingenuity prevailed. Shipwrights among the militia fashioned sledges to move the artillery overland. Hundreds of men, driven by sheer American determination, dragged the guns through marshy terrain and up the heights overlooking Louisbourg. They worked under the cover of darkness, moving cannon by night and positioning them in carefully prepared batteries before the French could respond. By the end of May, the Americans had erected 5 batteries, with the closest standing just 250 yards from the fort's walls. The final battery, bristling with heavy guns taken from the Grand Battery, was a testament to their grit and improvisation. Inside Louisbourg, hope dwindled by the hour. American artillery unleashed a relentless barrage, reducing the fort's walls and the town's buildings to little more than shattered rubble. Throughout May, the defenders endured the unyielding punishment, watching helplessly as their food supplies dwindled. Meanwhile, the Americans captured a French supply ship early in the siege, giving them plenty to eat while their enemies slowly starved. Yet one obstacle remained: the Island Battery. Its cannons dominated the harbor, keeping British warships at bay and shielding Louisbourg from a full naval assault. Determined now to end this stalemate, Pepperell planned a daring night raid on the battery. The raid, scheduled for May 23rd, was delayed after many of the militiamen drank themselves into uselessness. 3 days later, a force of 400 volunteers rode silently toward the Island Battery under the cover of night. They slipped ashore undetected, their boots crunching on the rocks in hushed determination. But one fool among them, either drunk on courage or lacking sense, let out a triumphant cheer to mark their arrival. The French, now fully aware of the danger, unleashed a devastating hail of fire on the attackers. By dawn, the toll was clear. 70 Americans lay dead on the beach and in the harbor, their bodies strewn where they had fallen. Another 119 had been taken prisoner, their assault crushed before it could gain any ground. For the defenders of Louisbourg, this small victory was their only moment of relief in an otherwise grim siege. The Americans, still undeterred, soon captured a second French supply ship, bolstering their already overwhelming stock of powder and shot. By mid-June, Pepperell and Commodore Warren knew that the time had come to finish the job. The walls of Louisbourg were crumbling under constant bombardment, but the situation in the American camp was now growing dire. Dysentery spread like wildfire, sapping the strength of the besiegers, while whispers of a French relief force loomed over the battlefield. Time was not on their side. An amphibious assault was planned, bold, decisive, and dangerous. But as the Americans moved into position for their final strike, a white flag suddenly rose above the battered French fort. Within Louisbourg, despair had reached its peak. The relentless shelling, dwindling supplies, and the grim certainty of defeat wore down the defenders and civilians alike. At last, on June 15th, the citizens prevailed upon Governor Duchambeau to surrender. He signaled his willingness to negotiate, and by June 17th, the terms were signed. The surrender terms allowed the French garrison and the town's population to return to France with all their possessions intact. For the Americans, this was a bitter pill to swallow. Many had fought not for strategy or patriotism, but for the promise of plunder. Now they were told their blood and sweat would yield them no spoils, and their grumbling echoed across the victorious camp. In the end, their dashed hopes of riches were the least of their troubles. The siege itself had cost the Americans roughly 100 men in combat deaths, a victory by those grim standards. But the months that followed were catastrophic. Disease ravaged the garrison, cutting down nearly 900 men before the fort was finally handed over to a British force in January of 1746. Even with such a grim aftermath, the Americans had every right to take pride in their achievement. The French government itself had never considered it possible that Louisbourg could fall to anything short of a massive professional army. That 4,000 untrained militia, farmers, fishermen, and merchants, had captured one of their greatest strongholds sent shockwaves through Europe. When word of the victory reached Boston, celebrations erupted with unrestrained joy. Even in London, the achievement of the New Englanders was met with cheers. Yet for all their bloodshed and triumph, their efforts were rendered meaningless by the cold arithmetic of diplomacy. At the negotiating table in Aix-la-Chapelle, the British agreed to return Louisbourg to France in exchange for Madras in India, a distant and unrelated theater of the same war. The conquest and the political betrayal that followed left deep scars on the American psyche. The victory at Louisbourg gave the colonists a heady confidence in their own military strength, even if that confidence was misplaced. Until this moment, their combat experience had been limited to skirmishes with disorganized native forces. Valuable, yes, but hardly comparable to the disciplined warfare of Europe. Yet their triumph over Louisbourg left them convinced that professional soldiers were overrated, and their own resolve and ingenuity could overcome even the strongest adversary. This newfound pride, inflated as it was, would echo down the years. When tensions with London finally ignited into open rebellion in 1775, the memory of Louisbourg bolstered their belief that they could stand against the might of the British Empire, which they did. Louisbourg also planted the seeds of resentment toward the British crown. When the fortress they had bled for was handed back to France, the colonists were outraged. Their sacrifice, their sweat, and their blood had been discarded, treated as nothing more than a pawn in Britain's global chessboard. When the next war with France erupted in 1755, the colonists approached Britain's call for aid with far less enthusiasm. They had learned the hard way that their sacrifices would serve imperial interests, not their own. By the time Britain needed to retake Louisbourg in 1758, the task proved as daunting as the French had always expected. It took 9,000 British regulars and 40 warships to seize the fortress that American militia had captured with far fewer men just a decade earlier. The colonists took a bitter satisfaction in hearing of that struggle. It only reaffirmed their belief in their own prowess and deepened their disdain for the so-called professionals of the British Army. This mindset, forged at Louisbourg, was neither an anomaly nor a fleeting attitude. It became part of the cultural fabric of early America, reinforced by the Revolutionary War's glorification of citizen soldiers and the disdain for standing armies inherited from British oppression. The myth of the self-reliant, untrained Minuteman, celebrated in song and story, lived on through the War of 1812 and even the Civil War, despite repeated failures of militia to match the effectiveness of disciplined, professional troops. World War I saw the United States again rely on hastily conscripted forces and citizen soldiers, only to watch the military shrink to pre-war levels afterward, a testament to how deeply ingrained this resistance to professionalism remained. But then came World War II, a war so vast, so technologically advanced, and so reliant on global coordination that it shattered the illusion that citizen soldiers alone could defend the nation. The Cold War sealed this transformation, forcing the United States to maintain, for the first time in its history, a massive standing military in peacetime. Louisbourg, however, was the beginning of the mindset that delayed this shift for nearly 2 centuries. The belief that sheer will and ingenuity could conquer all. It was not until the unforgiving crucible of World War II forced America to confront modern war's demands that this illusion began to give way to reality. And that reality was this: war, in its modern form, is a relentless and unforgiving master. It spares no room for sentiment, and it does not reward amateurism.